Thank you so much. So thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. It is really my pleasure to be here today. So I grew up in Switzerland, in Schaffhausen actually. Then I moved around the world, kind of fought the dragons, right? And come back now. So I'm very happy to be here and really look into ways how we can all collaborate, how we can make robots that can really help to protect the environment. And this, I hope I can put some light on the things that we have already done, and we can explore together how we can do things together in the future. I call the topic sustainability robotics, which is a new field at the interface of sustainability sciences and robotic science. So we have to formulate the hypothesis at the interface of the two fields, and if you do that correctly, we get the most impact into all these multidisciplinary journals that are out there. So I started at Imperial College as faculty in 2012, and the first person I hired was an engineer from Cambridge, who was brilliant. And the second person was Thomas Creedy, who's an ecologist from Oxford. With the idea on a grant actually that we obtained was, I think, the first grant I obtained, which was on using robots for biodiversity monitoring, so eDNA sampling in the rainforest. And that was in 2012. The idea was that we have currently this method of a human climbing up the tree to place a sensor. I'm not sure anyone here climbed trees like this. No, nobody, right? Not so much anymore, I guess, yeah? So, but this, at that time at least, was really the state-of-the-art method, right? It's very much dangerous, it's inaccessible, it takes time, it's expensive, and usually simple, kind of limited in terms of what can be sensed. So can we use robots to do that? At that time, however, robotics wasn't there yet. We couldn't buy platforms that were robust. Some of the algorithms weren't there yet. Also, it was a young lab that was setting up. So we didn't have the success we wanted. But since then, it has driven me to really try to innovate new types of robots that can do these type of things: sensor placement, sampling, physical interaction with the environment. And so in 2019, I set up this joint center between Empa and Imperial. We call this Materials and Technology Center of Robotics. And as you know, Empa is a research institute like WSL of the ETH domain, focused on material science and technology in Dübendorf. And out of that, we then started the Laboratory of Sustainability Robotics together with EPFL. The mission is to create a Swiss Army knife of environmental sensing, right? Where the tool is the robot, making it faster, cheaper, and less dangerous. And also have higher temporal spatial resolution, right? So instead of making one sample, you have 1,000 samples. Instead of putting sensors everywhere that are placed statically, you have mobile sensor networks that can even sense, and based on what they sense more with higher density in certain areas of interest. So adaptive information informed decision-making of where to sample next. And I think these are the frontiers in environmental sensing as well, of how we can do that better and collect better data. Okay, so thinking about robotics and drones, the state of the art today is vision-based drones, things like that you can buy, takes vision, like images, maybe three-dimensional maps based on the images. And this is commonly used in ecology. So many ecologists actually start to use that. The problem is that it can only do a certain amount of things. You can do certain things on the data that it collects. So if you collect the data, you can do some kind of services on top of that using some kind of machine learning and so on. And that's very impactful. But the next frontier will be on physical interaction, not just in natural environments, also in aging infrastructure, offshore assets, underground, extreme environment in construction. And the key technology is how to build robots that can physically interact with those environments to do sampling tasks, manipulation tasks, sensor placement, manufacturing, repair tasks. And this is what we really specialize in. Now, if you look at nature, there's a lot of things that we can learn. And in particular, we can analyze insects and see that they do a lot of things. So they do a co-evolution of sensing, control, materials, actuation, and aerodynamics. So it's not like they were evolved in simulation and then somebody built them, and then they're being used, linearly from sensing control to then becoming hardware. So they co-evolve all of this. And this is a philosophy of how they're built and how I think we should build our robots. Now, this way of building the robots, I'll come to that later in one slide, but it's a deeply integrated approach of combining the digital and physical intelligence. Okay, let me give you an example. So if you want to have a robot that lands on a surface, you can do that by having a lot of control and sensing on the platform. So it flies, pitches up, and attaches to the surface. This has been done, and it's fine if you have a computer and sensors that are high resolution, fast, but also heavy, they can do that. If you have a robot that is less than a gram in weight, in mass, you cannot do that because the computers and sensors are not there. Therefore, you can benefit from the physical interaction, from the physical interaction with the environment. So, for example, the fly doesn't kind of pitch up and land. It also uses its antennas and legs to crash and align to the surface mechanically. This is something that in the field we can call mechanical intelligence. So you have the digital intelligence or digital AI, and then you have the physical intelligence that is through the physical body, through the materials, that enables a lot of functionality and increases robustness. Okay, so sustainability robotics, we focus here on a few use cases. I'll give just a brief overview on some of the areas, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what we work on, to then have a template for discussions afterwards. The first one is autonomous sensing in forest environments. And then, of course, there are a lot of needs for that, from biomass estimation to biodiversity, tree biopsies, surgical interventions on trees, extreme events, and so on. I think you're the experts on this, right? So I don't need to tell you the need for what needs to be sensed. Our approach to this was to develop a family of robots that can interact physically with those environments. They can do perching, so attach themselves to the structures. They can also place sensors and do also visual inspection of the environment. The easiest or the first step is to do visual inspection. And this is something where we use the WSL data set on crown loss or crown density, which I'm not sure if anyone is here who labeled that. Anyone worked with this in the past? No? Okay, maybe online someone. But one of the big problems with these data sets is that you have to manually label them, right? So you have 1,000 images, and then you have someone who labels it and estimates how much density is there on this image, on the next image, and so on. Very labor intensive, data sets are not there yet fully because of that. So we augmented this data set with a synthetic data set where we used a game engine called Unity, where we can simulate trees with different densities, and like this complement this with the physical data set to then train a neural network model to then estimate based on images how much density there is on a tree. So the idea being we have a robot, drone flies through the forest, that can do in real time or with slight delay, a classification of the tree leaf density. And why is this important? This is important because of the crown loss disease of ash trees. You know, they have this kind of ash trees, they lose the leaves, and it's a big problem, at least in the UK, but I think also in Europe, everywhere. And so the idea is that we have an automated method how to do that. And so here we have two approaches. One is a relative ranking of tree leaf density, and one is an absolute ranking based on the data sets trained on. So this is useful. It was a nice paper. We were happy with this, but I think the key is really to combine that with physical samples, with physical interaction and surgical kind of measurements on the tree itself. Now, if you want to do that, how do we fly autonomously? How can we build a robot that can fly through the forest and do this interaction? And here again, we can learn from nature of how to do this with high robustness and little computational need. And in particular, bees use that to operate in unknown environments. They do something called optic flow divergence-based sensing. So which means that as you approach an object, the object expands, right? Like you come close to the wall gets, I mean, on your retina, you have a gradient field of expansion. This expansion is a proxy to the distance. And that has been used in robotics somewhat and is used in animals a lot to estimate the distance. Now, the problem is that as the surface is not flat, I mean, if you have a flat wall, then it's a linear proxy. But if it's not flat, then it can give you false alarms because it's an intrinsic method and not an absolute measurement to the distance. Okay, because of that, we had to implement a new approach to this, which we call the fictitious wall hypothesis, where we combine different sensor modalities into a extended Kalman filter and later on into a machine learning model, where we can then make the integration on the robot, allowing it to fly through the environment, even if it's three-dimensional or non-flat, and stop before objects. Yeah, stop before objects like trees, or fly through openings in the forest. Now, this looks a bit like any kind of remote controlled robot, right? The key difference is it's not remote control, it's fully autonomous, and it's fully on board. So it's on-board computation with full autonomy through completely unknown environments. And this is very interesting, I find, because we can, with 20 grams of electronics, solve autonomy for forest-dwelling drones. So it's a very low cost in terms of computational need and also financially. Actually, you can use, it uses the same sensors as the mouse has. Right? The mouse, they actually use the same here that measures the kind of optic flow field. And this can be used on those robots in a very lightweight manner. We can then combine it with tactile information and interact with physical environments, even if the environment is moving, if there's wind, if there's some complex interaction. So like real flying insects, it can combine vision, tactile information, and other sensing modalities to do this type of movement through the environment. Okay, so what happens, however, if you cannot see very well? The resolution of those sensors is not very high, so if you have an obstacle, you need to combine it with the robustness to the crash. And here's something that we published in 2018, where we looked into impact-resilient robots. So robots that have origami structures around them, allowing the robot to crash into objects and survive the crash. We call them also crash-happy drones. Whether they're really happy is a question, but at least they're not unhappy because they don't crash down. So it's an origami-based approach. So we use the Miura-Ori pattern. We can parameterize it, simulate it, manufacture it very easily. Having then a system here, classic kind of ring protector, and on the right side, the origami-based protector. And we see that for low velocities, one crashes immediately as very non-robust, and one with origami is actually much more robust and allows the robot to move quite well actually through the environment. So the combination of physical resilience, like crash happiness, if you want, plus minimalist sensing, I think this is the key for enabling a lot of robust motion in environments that you don't know about, right? Outdoor environments. Now then we were asking, well, can we use somehow metamorphosis or physical adaptation to not just to crash resilience, but actually have functionality? And the functionality we were looking at was on perching. So can we use robots that metamorph themselves to trees to attach themselves to trees? And so that's this paper here. It came out in 23, metamorphic aerial robots for shape morphing and perching, where we have this approach of composites that are pre-stretched, so that have a stretching layer, so an elastic layer in the manufacturing, and can allow it to attach itself from flight. So it would land and then perch itself like a tree-hugging drone, right? So it really is very much nature-loving drone. And because of that, it can remain flying, exactly, it can remain aloft and being non-invasive. And I think that's the key. So if it's perched, it's silent, it doesn't move, and the animals and plants are not negatively influenced. So it's a form of minimal invasive or even non-invasive sensing, in addition of it actually being prolonged in mission duration by a factor of 10 or 100 compared to flying drones. Now we are now working on these accelerated versions of that, where we can use the motion of the flight to dynamically perch, so to fly and then crash land on the tree and then attach itself to the tree. Okay, so what if you cannot approach a tree? What if, there's some kind of leaves and so on? And for that, we looked into ways how to place sensors on distance. So you can think the robot is a sensor, but you can also think about placing sensors. And in particular here by using a dart approach, right? So you fly, you then stabilize the drone in front of the structure or in front of the tree, then shooting darts to the tree. It has a precision of a few centimeters on a few meter distance. So it's actually quite precise because the model of the trajectory can be done quite well based on our kind of models we have. And we can then combine it with a three-dimensional mapping of the environment to identify perching spots or placement spots. So it can be a fully closed method of assessing the environment, identifying the key placement locations, and then manually, automatically placing the sensors. And this is what we try to do here in this validation in a forest in Croatia, where we wanted to measure the biodiversity across the canopy. And so here the drone was flying, placing the sensor on the tree, as you see here, and then measuring the biodiversity. So how would you measure biodiversity? You're the experts, right? What's the best way to measure biodiversity? Actually, I want to learn from you about this. We have one method here. What would you do on this sensor? It's an actual question. The eDNA sampling, yeah? Okay, so that's quite easy because it needs a little bit of material, right? Anything else? Yeah, exactly. Temperature, humidity. So we integrated a lot of sensors on this pod, and the key was the soundscapes, the acoustic signatures. I hired the ecologist in my group as well, Jenna Lawson. Maybe you know her. She wrote the PNAS paper on the acoustic monitoring at Imperial, which maybe you know was quite a well-known paper. So she was part of the group to study that. And so we integrated this with the machine learning method to quantify the bird species. So the quantity and species richness of the birds across the canopy. So basically it shows that this method can be a method to quantify biodiversity across the tree canopy. Now that's quite interesting for us because it's an evidence that actually robots can be helpful compared to manually kind of climbing up the trees. Okay, so but what is about these sensors, right? Can we, then we have to recover the sensors. What if we place 1,000 of them? And so the idea we had after was the question was, can we use sensors that are biodegradable, that we can just leave there, right? Can we work with materials to make acoustic monitoring devices or kind of pH level sensors and so on, light sensors that biodegrade in the environment, leaving zero environmental footprint? And this happens that Empa is very strong in as an institute on the material science of sustainable materials. And so we wrote this paper here in 22 on how robotics and biodegradable sensing can be integrated. But there's in the short term, it's about humidity, temperature, but eventually goes into more complex sensing modalities. And we can benefit a lot from the emerging field of bioelectronics in all of this, right? On how to make electronics that is biodegradable using carbon-based methods, how to make actuators, hydroscopically actuated actuators, for example, or batteries or capacitors or even biohybrid systems. And this is something that we work on for quite a while. Actually, we call this field transient robotics. So robots where the transient nature of them can benefit in terms of sensing or doing something when we want it and biodegrading when we don't want it anymore. So if you think about the robot, there's usually three parts. One is the structure, then the sensor and the actuator, or actuation and sensing system. And the overlap of that is the transient robot. So I'll give you just one example on each of those three areas to illustrate a bit how we think about that. So on the structural side, we work with the cellulose composite cryogels, they're called. So it's basically a cellulose mix with gelatin, for example, that we can then freeze dry and then create those kind of porous structures that you see here. Depending on how we mix them, depending on the composition, depending on the process parameters, it has different performances that it can have on the structural sense. We can then also study the biodegradability of this. So as you see on the top right, each mix has a certain biodegradation pattern, and we can also design that. So the key is how we can manufacture structures that have certain performance requirements or meet certain performance requirements while also having certain biodegradability requirements. And so actually this method is quite promising for this. On the sensing side, we work with functionalized cellulose substrates, which we can 3D print as well. So we can have a cellulose skin on the robot, and then we have electronics like carbon ink-based printing, stencil printing, or inkjet printing, where we can then make those electronic devices on top of the robot. So you see a robot here on the bottom right, which is a glider, that has these black electronic devices on the structure doing a proprioception, so measuring its state, so the deflection of the wings during operation, and kind of like this closed cycle for the control system as well. So this is fully biodegradable, the wings, to show how electronics can be integrated. Okay, so then on the actuation side, we can work with humidity responsive composites. This means it's cellulose based and there's several layers. One layer is expanding as it gets wet and then it kind of bends, and like this we can have an actuator. We integrated a pod on a glider that you see here, which opens up when it encounters humidity and exposes then a red material, which is litmus, right? It's this pH active material, to then change the color depending on the pH level, right? So it's a self-actuating or environmentally triggered actuator on a fully passive glider that gets dispersed in the environment to then measure by pH levels without any electronics, being 100% biodegradable. And so that's early days in terms of applications, but it's kind of the emerging field of biodegradable or transient robotics. Okay, good. So here another example of a drone that places a sensor that is coiling, which we can pre-program with the manufacturing method to then place sensors on trees and so on. And this is another paper we showcased last year. Good. Basically, transient robotics is about not just building and using a robot and then throwing it away, but integrating it into the life cycle, the natural life cycle. So robots becoming more like lifelike systems that have their own kind of cycles and can bring value across the life cycle that they have. We can also think about regrowing them. You know, how can we build them such that they self-heal or that we can even farm robots? And this is something that we are also working on right now. Okay, good. So the second field, which I'll touch on just briefly, is the idea on infrastructure monitoring of offshore assets and so on. We have quite a lot of activities on that we had over the last years. And one key aspect is to go from biology to superheroes, going from insects, but going into kind of superhuman or super animal faculties. And Spider-Man is one of my favorite ones. And so we build various robots that can do something like Spider-Man by doing weaving, so collective weaving or construction using tensile elements to make perching structures. And actually we showed that also around trees, how you can then perch based on this woven kind of scaffolds. And then use that also similarly on here in the nest building to do perching and physical interaction, sensor placement, surface inspection on the infrastructure. So it attaches, places the sensor, here again, fully autonomous, then perches down and can do physical monitoring on the surface, scratching, sampling, planting something, depositing materials even, and so on. And again, fully autonomous. So it doesn't need some kind of very skilled human operator. It has its own control system to do that. And then we can also combine this with an admittance control scheme to have physical interaction and measure the kind of forces with the environment. Here with a self-tightening gripper that can allow itself to attach the robot even if the architecture of the tree is not known. So it's a form of physical adaptation to do the anchoring on the structure. Again, combining physical intelligence of the gripper with the digital intelligence of the control system to measure the compliance of the environment. Okay, so I mean, I could talk about this for longer, but just to mention that we work on that. We also wrote a book, edited the book on infrastructure robotics. So I think there's a big field and need for physical interaction in infrastructures and so on. And actually we can think about the natural infrastructure being the next high value asset of humanity, right? So I think it's not so disconnected, actually. I think the two fields have actually merged. Good, then just to mention briefly another kind of dimension to that, which is neural networks for control and dynamic perching, where we can combine reinforcement learning and simulation to learn how to perch to those structures, how to do the swinging, so we can train the models. We can then have different kind of rewards for reinforcement learning, ending up with systems that can fly and then optimally kind of anchor to the environment. Again, exploiting the physical adaptation of the string to the environment, because often the trees is not the predefined geometry, right? You want to perch even if you don't exactly know how the tree looks like. So this can be quite a valuable method. A kind of applied version of that is the tensile perching, which is an entanglement mechanism that has its own actuator at the end. So it's a flying platform with an end effector on a string, which is based on the same idea, which can then entangle itself and fly and stabilize the drone around trees. As you see here, so it would fly, you can swing it, but you can also actuate it or to disentangle itself, because the disentangling is actually quite challenging. So we built those systems, characterized it in the forest, and studied the optimal energy consumption. So how much on disentanglement, where are the optimas in terms of weight of the different components, and when does this method make sense compared to flying, compared to static perching, and so on. So this is more details in the paper, and there are some optimas that we can study based on the mission that we want to do. So if you say, oh, we have this tree or this forest, we need these parameters, then we can optimize the platform to optimize the entire mission to have it fast and cheaply. Good. So the third topic I'll just to briefly want to mention to you is this idea to have drones that don't just live on trees in the forest, on infrastructure, but they can survive extreme environments. And one of the extreme environments was this catastrophe here in London, right? And at that time I was living in London actually, and I was living close by that. I was driving by in the morning by the tower. You remember this catastrophe, right? It was in the news. More than 72 people died in this fire. And at that time, with the aerial robotics lab, I got a phone call like, do you have a drone that can fly inside of that? Yeah, of course, we didn't have, right? No drone is made for fire, right? But it kind of inspired us to think about fire-resilient drones. And if you do that, we can analyze animals that do temperature resilience using kind of geometric optimization, kind of like this, surface volume ratio, this famous example. But also there are other things such as heat evaporating structures that do the heat transfer, or kind of radiation and convection kind of methods that can protect the heat or the cold of the animal. So using these principles, we built the fire drone, which is a temperature agnostic robot that uses aerogel in its structure. Aerogel, you familiar with that? Aerogel is a material, yeah, some yes, some no. Yeah, so aerogel is a material that is about 95, 98% air. So it's like very lightweight. And there's this famous picture of aerogel with the flame and the flower on top. That's one of the famous pictures. Usually it's based on silica. So silica aerogel, which is very brittle and also shrinks as it gets hot. So it's very, very difficult to build any robot from that. So here, together with our partners at Empa, we had to develop a new type of aerogel, which is a polyamide fiber reinforced aerogel that is not shrinking and is not as brittle. Because of that, we can build robotic components from that, which we did here. So it's the shell that is made of aerogel, but it is a structural component. It's not just heat kind of protection. We then can integrate that with the motors being in the body of the robot. We can have this CO2 cartridge for any thermal management inside to cool it down if you want, and then integrate the overall robot like that. We then test this in fire, but also in a glacier. Actually here, with Professor Farinotti, which you might know, right? So we did just some testing in a glacier environment, so it works for hot as well as in cold environment. Because in cold, of course, you have always the challenge of the battery depleting very fast. So I think we need methods for improving that. So basically, the key here is to have robots that can fly around those very hot environments in order to collect information for firefighting. And then this information can help in faster decision making. And if the delta in time can be achieved, then the delta in output impact is very, very large because it's an exponential growth of the fire, for example. So it's for house fires, forest fires, tunnel fires, but also generally for any kind of hot environments such as ovens or chimney inspection and so on. And so, of course, there's some interest in that, and we were surprised how much industry contacted us about this. So there's a big field of interest for such inspection and monitoring robots. And because of that, we are now launching a fire drone startup on that. We have several funded positions, some first award that we won in an Inno-Swiss bridge project also. So we're looking forward very much to partner on that, on applications, but also to actually offer it as a product. Good. The next topic is this idea to have robots that don't just measure, but they also interact with the environment. So what if we could have robots that would manufacture the environment, right? So imagine Mars, or imagine a forest or a mountain region, right? Can we have robots that 3D print structures collectively from air, from ground, with humans in inaccessible environments? So 3D printing drones. Okay, so I was talking about this in 2013, and people were like, "Yeah, for sure, right? What about the payload? You know, what about the flight time? And you know, and anyway, it's not needed, and so on." Okay, so eventually we analyzed animals, how to do that, right? We published a review on this, on the principles of decentralized, environmentally triggered decision-making and stigmergic construction and so on. So there's some very interesting processes in nature that are very useful. And we obtained funding for this and so on, and build a robot that can do this. So it can fly, stabilize the printing head, and extrude material from the body. Here, cementitious material. It's a custom cementitious high-performance material. It's custom hardware, custom control, custom autonomy, and multi-agent control. So it's the architecture, material, hardware, software that needs to come together for this. We need to co-evolve those disciplines. Here, proof of concept on 27-layer cement structure being printed with the precision of a few millimeters. Now, what if the material is less predictable? What if you use some kind of material that is foam or that expands in some strange way that is hard to predict exactly? As you place it, it's not just the precision of the end effector, it's the precision of the material or the behavior or the flowing of the material. So because of that, we integrated a scan drone. So a scan drone that scans the structure after several layers or each layer, and then informs the next printing step. So like this, it creates a closed loop aerial additive manufacturing process where the scanning and printing is coupled. Now, a normal 3D printer in a lab, you know, is open loop. It just prints and you assume that you know what you're printing, right? It's very controlled. But for this process, we need the closed loop, right? We need to monitor it in terms of geometry, but also we can combine it to a structural model and structural estimation of what it has built to then build the next step to make it structurally integral. So here we stopped at 2 meters, just out of time reasons, but it shows that at 72 layers here, it works actually in a quite scalable manner. Yeah, so it keeps on doing that. Good. We can then look into also multi-agent systems of how multiple robots would assign print tasks dynamically, not just doing closed loop manufacturing locally when they print, but also globally as a kind of swarm to allocate tasks to each other to then print larger structures. So we did simulations and manufacturing of very large structures to optimize the paths and so the time, and can parallelize the process compared to single ground-based 3D printers. The whole thing came out in 22, which made us quite delighted. Also because of this multidisciplinarity of the project, right? And so also it was on the feature on the cover, which was very nice, of the journal. And so there's a lot of kind of manufacturing kind of advancement in this closed loop nature of it. We also went to Venice to the Architecture Biennale, where we exhibited that for 6 months in 23. Also touching on the point of how architecture now is changed with that, right? What can be built if we have those type of robots? And I think what I would like to do is to look more into biological materials, right? And natural environments, forests and so on, where we can apply different similar methods. From an industrial point of view, I think one useful point, of course, here is repair. And this is one robot that is in revision right now, so that shows automated repair, stabilized repair tasks on damages of pipelines, for example. So I think that's a very industrial use case that is very important. Okay, so the last topic, just to briefly touch upon, is this idea to build drones that don't just do all of this kind of interaction and manufacturing and so on, but then can also fly and dive into the water. What if we would have robots that can move in both air and water? That would be quite nice. And so we work on that for the last 12 years or so, and have this vision of aerial aquatic robots to protect aquatic ecosystems. The use cases are water health monitoring in the Arctic, around coral reefs, in lakes, catchment area monitoring, but also environmental DNA, biodiversity monitoring. So I know you might not be working so much with water, but I think there's certainly an interest and an interface as well between water, blue-green economy and so on. So there's certainly the interface, I think, is key and often very inaccessible. So marsh regions or kind of coastal regions are very hard to monitor. You know, it's really hard to know what really happens there. So one of the projects, we call it Medusa. It's a robot that can land on the water and then deploy an underwater pod to do sampling or inspection underwater. So it's a hybrid aerial aquatic vehicle that we developed. You see the picture here. We then connected to EAWAG, to some colleagues there, to try to combine this and compare it to those static test stations that they have. And so here's the test where we had then the robot, the Medusa, it flies, it lands on the lake, and can deploy this underwater pod. This underwater pod has a filter, so it can filter the water, and we can measure the chlorophyll A of the water. Based on that, we can get insights on algae growth, which gives some kind of proxy for cyanobacteria and this cyano kind of blue algae problems in lakes. Right, so and this worked quite well, so we integrated that. And we compared it to the static kind of traditional method, showing that actually we measure the same thing. And this is quite interesting. So you can do it with a boat, or you can do it with a robot, or many robots, you know, providing much better, more data. And I think that's, again, it's a methodological contribution to the field, which also is published in environmental sciences journals here, first study on that. So however, if you want to build robots that fly in air, dive underwater, we have to really understand the physics. And it's non-trivial because of this physical kind of like multi-flow nature of water entry and exit, right? There's bubbles, it's a huge mess. From a fluid mechanics point of view, it's very difficult to model that. So we started with actuation. So we made here a mission cycle that we have a robot that is underwater, then jets out of the water, glides, and then refills. The idea being that we have here water reactive chemicals that react with the water and then boost the robot out of the water. So we looked into that and different kind of chemicals that could do that, and wrote this paper here, came out in 2019, on this flying fish inspired aquatic jump gliding, right, from the water, which is basically a water vehicle that jumps out of water and can glide. And it works by having a combustion chamber that fills with water. We then take a few droplets to a calcium carbide tank. And calcium carbide, you're familiar with that, I used to make these lamps from in the 100 years ago. So calcium carbide is a very beautiful chemical. I really like it because when you mix it with water, it creates acetylene gas, which you can ignite. And then it does exactly that. It ignites and then can eject the water out of the combustion chamber. So it's fully passive. It also, this tube chokes because the pressure increase. So in the whole process, the only moving part is the little pump here that takes a little bit of this water in the chamber. Everything else is fully passively designed from the structural point of view. Anyway, we then have this combustion. We can study that, model this, integrate it in test setups and so on. We worked on that for a while, and can then build a robot that would live in a lake here around London, and then jet itself out by doing this combustion. So you see the water jetting, then you will see some spraying at the end, right, when it kind of mixes, and then a bit of fumes from the combustion, the gas jet. And it then keeps on gliding. So it glides a distance of about 23 meters using 0.3 grams of calcium carbide. So it's a very little that is needed for a quite powerful boost of jetting out of the water. So it's basically overcoming obstacles like Arctic regions, lakes, inaccessible environments. We also had a collaboration here earlier with the group at Harvard who builds the RoboBee. And the RoboBee also can fly in air, fly underwater. There's been some studies on that. And here we integrated a method of using hydrolysis to capture air and oxygen and hydrogen, and then ignite that to then boost the vehicle out of water, as you see here, and then jump out of the water. The whole thing at a weight, at a mass of, I think, 200 or 300 milligrams. That's a very small system that can actually fly and flap and fly, but also now transition between water and air. I mean, this type of system is very fundamental robotics science contribution, right? But many of variations of that, I think, can be used to actually be tested in the field. And one of those ones that can be tested in the field, you see here, 22, collaboration with a group of Li Wen is a remora approach to adhesion of the robots. So remora are these fish that adhere to the underwater animals or boats and so on. And it's a very robust method of adhesion. It's very robust to the geometry of the structure that it can adhere to. So this can be integrated on a drone and allowing it to do hitchhiking underwater. So it's a form of perching, if you want, to then save energy by kind of adhering it to the structure, boats or other animals or whales, let's say, and then move through the environment. With the propellers, we can also move between air and water and also attach to various kind of difficult environments, such as waterfalls, streams, also trees, and so on. So I think this is a capability that is quite robust. Now, coming back to the energy question, I think there are methods of how to also increase energy efficiency, for example, by using sailing. And sailing is used by swans or also some spiders that sail by using environmental vectors or wind to do so. So we built these sailing micro air vehicles, which are basically robots. I just showed a video. It's basically a robot that can fly, land on the water surface, then reconfigure the wings into sails, and then do sailing to save energy and be less invasive, right? So not be noisy. And this allows it to then operate in different environments where wind is. We developed the hardware from scratch on this. I mean, this doesn't exist. So all the wings, the design, the conception, the architecture, the fluid mechanics modeling, the modeling of the hulls, the control system, and the electronics is all developed from scratch here. And so we can then test this and have this transition from water to air. So it goes from a displacement regime to hydroplaning to then ground-assisted takeoff to do takeoff. So we didn't focus so much on the aerial phase, more on the sailing to start with, because the sailing itself has quite a lot of value for taking environmental data. And this environmental data, we, for example, tested in Croatia in a protected lake. And in this protected lake, there are some regions that are protected. So there's some birds that live there. And so we integrated the robot. Oh, there should be a video. Ah, yeah, exactly. So basically it was sailing for, I think, 12 kilometers on the lake, doing bioacoustic monitoring of the birds. And so it showed that we did it twice, once in winter, once in summer, and showed that there is a higher biodiversity in the protected environments. So protection helps. And also there were some ecologists who told us that the animals we were picked up with this sensing method, they weren't able to find manually. And this is really interesting because it's a less invasive method of environmental sensing compared to some kind of manual human going there with a boat or manually. So I think using robots can have a lot of value in that sense as well. So we worked on that for a while, also published a book on aerial aquatic vehicles. If you're interested in more details, I just mentioned briefly here a couple of them. But I think the key message for today is that we can always do this journey of having a new concept in robotics, then doing our homework, building the robots, right, doing the engineering of that, doing the field testing, but then collecting data to then get insights onto the environment, as I mentioned with the SailMath. So I think this journey is the key, right? New robots providing new insights instead of using off-the-shelf robots like anyone can have, right? So I think the key opportunity is to team up and look into ways how we can use some of more advanced next generation robots to collect better data. And going from bio-inspired to superhero-inspired robots, we now work on God-inspired robots. And one of the favorite ones is Proteus. And if you know, Proteus is a Greek god from Greek mythology that is able to metamorph itself and move underwater and on land and so on. And so here's the interpretation of AI of how Proteus could look like, which is quite interesting. Our interpretation on the project was the Proteus drone, which is this metamorphic tri-modal mobility in robotics. So we have this grant that started last year, 23 now, on making robots that can metamorph its body to fly in air, fly underwater, and sail on the water surface using fully soft, adaptive structures. So it's a work on materials, control, sensing, self-sensing on the robot, operation, but also field testing and impact studies. So we want to do the whole way from fundamentals in robotics to applied robotics or kind of environmental impact. And so how do we build robots? And I would like to just close with one statement on philosophy of how we build. And this philosophy, we call it physical AI. Physical AI is the co-evolution of material science, robotic science, environmental science, right? To create impact in life-like robots that have value in sustainability. So we wrote a position paper on that in 2020. And it's a key method to show that we need to develop this in a multidisciplinary manner to create those lifelike robots. Also, there's this bio-inspired design paradigm that in 2014 I wrote a paper on to kind of outline how to take biological inspiration. But I think the key comes together into multidisciplinarity. And so in this paper, we've kind of defined the term of physical AI, what we mean by it. And I was very happy to see the NVIDIA keynote earlier this month, where we go from generative AI, agentic AI to physical AI. Physical AI in some way being the ultimate of combining digital kind of learning-based method into the physical world. And I think in many ways, I believe that this is really the holy grail of robotics, making lifelike robots that live in the environment, like an immune system of the environment. And this is what we really want to do in the long term. So to finish, I would like to just say a word on infrastructure. So at Imperial College, we built up this laboratory. It was based on a philanthropic gift, which was very helpful to test the robots. And it's located in South Kensington next to Hyde Park. So it's a beautiful location. So this gray structure is the lab that we built based on the gift. And there are a lot of indoor flight arenas, one at Imperial, but also at Empa we have one, ETH has one, and so on. So indoor flight arenas exist. Outdoor environments also exist. I think WSL also has outdoor environments to test robots and so on. But typically, we are still constrained by the regulation in those environments. If you have some experimental new robot, it's very hard to get insurance, to get permission, and so on. So because of that, we need something in between the two. And this gap we are now filling with the drone hub. The drone hub is a new facility in Dübendorf. It's part of the Nest building. And the Nest building is this building that you see here that exists to study new building technologies. So each unit represents a building with new technologies inside of it. The drone hub is the latest addition that was opened in November, where we have three innovation elements. One is a facade for aerial additive manufacturing, where we can study how robots can do repair tasks, manufacturing tasks. The second one being a biosphere, where we can have the robots biodegrade, place sensors, plant structures, or do kind of some smart agriculture use cases. And the third is the interface with the building itself. So like the immune system of the building being a mobile agent, a robot that can do interaction. So the high load is what you see here is our current headquarters. And so we'll expand there. So this is where the lab is at the moment. So if you visit, I'll show you all this around. So I'll move quickly through that because we're running out of time. Anyway, so it opened in November. We have indoor flight arenas at Imperial, but also at Empa, larger ones, which we are developing. And we are moving to a new building in Empa, where we have a big flight arena of 34 meters length, where we want to integrate some new test environments, which is also an opportunity for collaboration. So it's planned to be this building here, which is 15 meters high, 34 meters long, where we can have different use cases to really test also robots in GPS-denied environments and also inside of the big hall. Last but not least is the aquatic test platform like Explore in Lake Geneva that also we are now looking at integrating our robots with to make this an autonomous platform, robotically enabled platform. So a lot of assets which are needed to study and build those type of robots. Now to summarize, I think drones can quantify biodiversity. You've seen that, so it's a promising method. Bio-inspired methods can help in robustness. Metamorphosis is key in functionality increase. Physical AI is the coevolution of those disciplines, and I think that's the key, how to work together across disciplines. The drone hub and all the others assets are helpful in actually studying that. And last but not least, I would just like to invite everyone to join us in the mission to build robots for a better world. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mirko, for this travel through a world that is completely unknown to me, at least. And we have time for some questions. Who wants to start?
Thank you very much for the talk, very inspiring. And yeah, also like to see this combination of material science and robotics. I have two questions. One is very practical and second, maybe more theoretical. One is about this drone that can do the dart. How do you do with recoil or kickback? I thought like when you when you shoot something, you should have a kickback. And then the second one, how do we farm robots?
A very good point. Yeah, thank you. So the kickback is not very strong on the drone. So we currently don't change. I think we don't change the control system on the drone to balance that. It could be actively balanced. So it depends on the energy you put in. So it kind of has a bit of kickback, but then stabilizes. So it's fine. But if it's stronger, it needs to stabilize with the control system. So it could be like preloading the behavior and then shooting to stabilize. The second one, what is a robot? Many things are a robot. Typically, it's an input-output relationship. So you have an input and then there's some kind of computation and have an output back to the world. For me, however, the robot needs to move in the environment. So it needs to move. So a washing machine does the same, but it's not a robot as such. So mobility is important, and the uncertainty of the environment and dealing with the uncertainty is key. Because it's not a lab. The world is not a lab, right? We never know what's going to happen, how the environment changes, what the compliance is of the environment. Wind is there, dirt is there, sensor degradation is there, manufacturing in precision is there as well. So I think a real robot or a lifelike robot deals with that. And it deals with it not just in a computational sense as a control system, like digitally, but it does it physically as well. And I think for me, the real robot is this full integration of making basically living artificial animals.
Okay, so I'm somehow terrified.
It's good news.
Right. So it's almost like you can make these insect robots, right? And so you basically could replace all pollinators with little robots that might even do a better job because they would, I don't know, be able to sense exactly which flower, etc. Does this worry you? I mean, so
the RoboBee project, the one that I showed,
exactly.
it was motivated. It was an NSF-funded project, actually, at Harvard, MIT, and others, to make artificial pollinators. Yeah, and of course, it's much more difficult than that, right? There are some artificial hummingbirds, right, that have been built by DARPA. So there's a lot of work around this, but I think in terms of environmental sensing, very small insect size is difficult. A little bit larger, like mesoscale, bird size, I think a lot is possible. Yeah, to protect the environment.
Okay, there's a question in the chat.
Yes. Silke Bauer says, thanks for the extremely inspiring talk. I had a question with regard to aerial biodiversity sampling. Would it be possible right now to sample the airspace for insects? I mean, flying a UAV to specific altitudes is no problem, but the density of insect is low, thus requiring either long sampling times or a possibility to suck in larger volumes of air. And further, could you imagine a system that gets real-time information from a radar of the altitude at which many insects are currently flying and sampled there?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It is very interesting. In fact, in the work in Honduras in 2012-13, the state-of-the-art method to do sampling of insects is to spray the tree with pesticide, with these kind of big sprayers, and then collect everything that drops down and make a soup and identify the DNA of the animals there, which of course is a somewhat invasive method. So I think there are better methods where we can use robots, robot motion, and different kind of mechanisms to do this type of sampling, which we have explored. I didn't talk about it today, and I don't know who asked the question. So I would suggest to reach out and we can discuss this in particular in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I was very fascinated about the biodegradable robots. So I wonder what is the lifespan of these materials? How long do they last in the field? And what is the cost? Of course, now we are at the prototype stage, so they're very expensive, but if they could become more affordable in the future.
Yeah, so how long is the ideal survival rate and when should it biodegrade? Like many things biodegrade eventually, but you want to make it such that it doesn't influence negatively the environment. So we look at something like a month or two, or a couple of weeks to do the biodegradation. Of course, it depends a lot on the environmental conditions and microorganisms and so on. So it's a couple of weeks, and we want to design it such that it works for a few days and then biodegrades within a few weeks, let's say, roughly. And the cost, I think, is very low because it's cellulose-based and carbon ink based. So the material cost is not very, very much. I think we can make very accessible robots using this type of method. Accessible not just for privileged countries like we are here, but also environments and countries that have much less resources, where we could have swarms of those in a very non-invasive and accessible manner. And so that's part of the motivation too.
If I may, a quick follow-up. Sure, the material cost is going to be low, but like the full life cycle of designing the robot, putting it in print and deploying it, I was thinking more on that side.
I mean, there's some works by other groups who looked into cardboard robots that can be made manually and then be deployed in air to do some form of sensing. So paper airplanes. I mean, it's a bit of a simplification, but if you think about paper airplanes, what you can do if you enhance this with some form of sensing, actuation, structural integrity, and so on, I think a lot can be done at like minimal cost compared to electronics-based, battery, PCB-based methods, carbon fiber-based methods, and so on. So I think it's very rich, and in terms of manufacturing, you just need to think about it conceptually, how to design them to be cheap and easy to manufacture.
Any other questions? That is not the case. I have one.
Okay.
A fire drone. How long does it survive in fire?
Yeah, fire has 2,000 degrees centigrade, something like this, which is quite high. So flying inside of the flame is not the design point. The design point was, I think we said 10 minutes at 200 degrees, which is a hot environment, inaccessible for humans, and a normal drone would decay with much faster. So that's based on interviews with firefighters, that was a reasonable kind of design point. Then at higher temperatures less, but we didn't test it to destruction. So I think we don't know the extreme parts of that, what is possible. But I think inaccessible hot environments is the design point.
Exactly. So it's kind of monitoring the fire.
Yeah, monitoring, identifying people, structural integrity.
Right, yes.
Yeah. So just by going in, like instead of a human going in, but there's no smoke and some fire, sending a drone to get first insights is hugely valuable, right? And like, do you need to go in that building or not, right? Mm. Huge decision, right, of a firefighter. So, yeah.
Okay. Oh, there is one. The last one, maybe.
Thank you. Sorry, just because you mentioned the destruction, how many robots die in the process of developing a publishable robot? Is that like 10 or is that 200 that crash or that get, I don't know, destroyed by whatever, fire or things like that?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. have a moment of calm, peace, right? For all the dead robots, we need that. Yeah, so I usually say like for 10 seconds of video is about 1 year of work, right? So it is a lot, right? It's an iterative, it's a lot about designing, testing, doesn't work, controlling, debugging the code, updating the libraries, you know, like moving from ROS 1 to ROS 2, which is a kind of big change on the operating systems happening now. It's a lot of stuff that needs to be figured out, right? So it's not as easy as it looks in a video. And doing this whole thing in the field is even one level more difficult. So it's not easy. So the expectation of you buy a product in the shop, like a drone, compared to experimental new types of platform, it's not the same readiness level. So it needs more work, new development of new platforms and so on. Yeah.
Good, thank you very much. And I think with this last question, and well, all the dead drones, we end here. There's a table reserved, so if somebody wants to join in the cafeteria, please do so. And there are some meetings in the afternoon with Mirko. And you heard about it. Mirko is at Empa, so he is easy to get in contact with him. Okay, thank you very much.